coming. I'm a cognitive psychologist, a brain scientist, and my laboratory studies the impact of music on the brain, and I have a particular interest in creativity, and especially creativity in music. If you ask the average person to tell you in the abstract what creativity is, they say things like, oh, it's something that's unique, never been done before, breaks the mold. And what I'd like to suggest to you today is that in reality, as opposed to the abstract definition, when we talk about concrete things, at least those in music, that we find the most exquisitely creative, they tend not to be breaking of the mold and breaking all the rules. In fact, I think that creativity in music is marked not so much by revolution, but by evolution. And I'd like to illustrate this with some musical examples, starting with what I believe is probably the first rock and roll song ever created. I spent many years scouring libraries, trying to find the seeds of rock and roll. I mean, we all think of rock and roll as having started with Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly and Elvis and Little Richard, but it seemed as though there might have been some precursors of that, and I think I found it. Several years before the acknowledged beginning of rock and roll. This is from 1951. It's Jackie Brenson and his Delta Cats doing Rocket 88.
Women have heard of jalopies, you've heard the noise they make, but let me introduce my new Rocket 88. Yes, it's straight, just one way. Everybody likes my Rocket 88. Baby, we'll ride in style.
So here you've got a song that's got those rhythms that we associate with rock and roll. It's a song about a car. It's a guy boasting about how great his car is, and of course we know that's a metaphor for how great something else is. And it's got all the seeds of rock and roll. This is 1951, several years before the acknowledged birth of rock and roll. So what is that Chuck Berry did? What is it that Chuck Berry did that gives him the title of the grandfather, one of the great architects of rock and roll? Well, he took all of those horn lines, riffs that Jackie Brenson had horns playing, and he put them on an electric guitar. He kept the same beat. He wrote songs about cars and about traveling. Basically, it's the same song to my ears. The evolution, not the revolution, the evolution that created rock and roll was that simple change of instrumentation from horns to electric guitar. Here's Chuck Berry.
They're really rocking in Boston and Pittsburgh, PA, deep in the heart of Texas and round the Frisco Bay, all over St. Louis and down in New Orleans, all the cats gonna dance with sweet little 16.
Now the next big evolution of rock and roll, arguably, was the surf sound of the Beach Boys. We moved the clock up 6 years later, and what did the Beach Boys do? They didn't break any rules, really. They took Chuck Berry's music and they added sort of stacked harmonies like you might have found in the Andrews Sisters 20 years earlier. Here are the Beach Boys.
You'll catch them surfing at inside, outside, Ventura County line, inside, outside, Santa Cruz and Inside, Australia's Caribbean, inside, outside, all over Manhattan, and down Doheny Way, inside, outside, everybody's gone surfing, surfing USA.
Now, if that sounds like the same song to you as Chuck Berry's song from 6 years earlier, you're right. In fact, a judge agrees with you. Chuck Berry sued the Beach Boys for stealing his song, and he won. So if you own a copy of the record that was pressed before the court settlement, the record will say it was, Surfin' USA was written by Brian Wilson, but if you own it after the court settlement, it's Brian Wilson / Chuck Berry. And what did the Beatles do with this? Well, the Beatles were the most famous thieves of all, by their own admission. Lennon and McCartney make no bones about the fact that their genius, their extreme creativity, came from trying to sound like other bands. They tried to sound like Little Richard, like Chuck Berry, like Carl Perkins, like the Everly Brothers, and through their own fingers and through their own vocal cords, they weren't quite able to nail the sounds they were after, and they came up with what many of us regard as the most creative and the most interesting output in popular music in the last 50 years. But again, through evolution rather than revolution, here's the Beatles paying tribute to the Beach Boys and, by default, Chuck Berry.
Well, the great girls really knock me out. They leave the West behind. And my small girls make me sing and shout. That Georgia's always on my mind. Oh, come on!
So, the Beatles, I said, were great thieves. Here's a record from 1956, recorded by a then unknown producer named George Martin for a boogie-woogie piano player named Humphrey Littleton. 1956. See if this doesn't sound familiar. Years later, Paul McCartney comes up with this gem.
Lady Madonna, children at your feet, wonder how you manage to make ends meet.
Now, the interesting thing to me about this is that I remember hearing this as a kid and thinking, wow, where did that come from? That doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. And what musicians will tell you is that they're almost always stealing. The trick is that they steal from places where you wouldn't think to look, or they somehow manage to put their own stamp on it so that the influence is hidden. And I think that's really what was going on with the Beatles. Now, let's take another case of creativity. Often, creativity involves, in music, I think, working under very tight constraints. The artist who created this next track set himself the constraint of trying to create a recording of a well-known musical piece using nothing but power tools. Now, how did this come about? This fellow was a home hobbyist woodworker, and he noticed that when he put particularly dense or thick pieces of wood through his table saw, it slowed down the motor, and there was an apparent change of pitch, and he wondered if he could play a melody with that. So what you're going to hear now is a recording made with 2 table saws. He's lined up the pieces of wood on a bench. He's pushing them through the table saws in real time in order to create a melody. And just to add a little bit of tonal color, you're going to hear him pounding on a brake drum with a ball-peen hammer. I'd like to have your help here if we can have the house lights. I'd like you to raise your hand as soon as you recognize this piece. Think about what happened here. He's creating something that many people regard as extremely innovative. Who would have thought that you could play Beethovens Fifth on a table saw, right? He's working under constraints. And what I'd like to argue is that all of the rock and roll musicians that we were talking about before were working under constraints, and that in fact, that's what musical creativity is. In its essence, it's working within a system of constraints. Another one of the musical giants in our history, one of the people that everyone considers to be one of the great geniuses of musical history, is Mozart. But Mozart didn't invent the symphony. All he did was work within the constraint of the symphony, pushing at the boundaries of it, and again with the constraint of there's only 12 notes. He didn't invent any new notes, he didn't invent a new musical form, but we regard Mozart as a genius because of what he was able to do under those constraints, that he was able to accomplish things under constraints that other people were not. And I'd argue that that's what was going on with Jackie Brenson and with the Beach Boys and Chuck Berry and the Beatles, and of course with Woody Phillips, who played Beethoven's Fifth on power tools. I'd like to try another constraint that I find very interesting when musicians take a well-known musical piece and render it in a different musical style. I'd like to jump ahead to track 10, see if you recognize this. This is a well-known song done as a bluegrass number by John Hartford.
Like you were the only one.
Anybody recognize it?
Didn't I give you everything I could? But how didn't I, babe? After all the love I gave you, still wasn't enough. Now, babe, this man's gonna get tough. Come on, come on, come on, take it down. Take another little piece of my heart now, babe. Take another little piece and just throw it away.
And here's the version you probably know better. Track 11. What I find fascinating about this is that it's the same song. What John Hartford set out to do was to take a classic psychedelic rock song from the 60s, render it with bluegrass instruments in a bluegrass style. I find that, and many other people find that, tremendously creative. So again, the message is that creativity in music is working under a systems of constraints. It generally involves evolution rather than revolution. And I think this applies in general to other art forms, although I'm only making the case for music, that if we can work within constraints and add something new that nobody else who was in that domain ever thought of before, then we have something that's really extraordinary. Thank you very much.